We'll move on to Doug McWhirter. Doug is with Wyoming Game and Fish. This is the first of the jurisdictional updates, and he's obviously going to present on bighorn sheep disease management in Wyoming. Over to you, Doug. Are you perhaps on mute?
There we go. Couldn't find the right. All right. Thanks, Margot. I need to say that I'm presenting this on behalf of Hank Edwards, the supervisor of our Wildlife Health Lab, and also Assistant State Wildlife Veterinarian Meredith Van Wyck as well. I was going to title this Bighorn Sheep Disease Management and Prevention in Wyoming, but I kind of thought the prevention part was perhaps a little too optimistic based on what you'll hear shortly. So everybody's pretty familiar with Ernest Thompson Seton's estimates of bighorn sheep in pre-settlement times. This is what his guess at distribution pre-settlement was. If you look at that in 1940, we essentially lost all of what we would term our low to mid elevation sheep herds, prairie adapted sheep, canyon adapted sheep, and they were mostly just in the northwest corner of the state. Estimates at the time were about 2,500 bighorn sheep. If you move forward to Buchner's monograph in 1960, the distribution really didn't change that much over the last 20 years from the 40s to the 60s. Estimates still around 2,000 sheep. So if you look at that currently, these are our occupied habitat maps from WAFA. In 2020, we do have an expansion of sheep herds, mostly through translocations, and also our numbers have rebounded to where we're approximately at 6,300 sheep statewide currently. But that's not to say we don't have continuing difficulties, and a lot of those are disease-based challenges. To set up the stage with the current situation in Wyoming, the map on the left of your screen is the areas where we hunt bighorn sheep in Wyoming. And if you look at the graphs on the right, those are hunter numbers and ram harvest through time. These are all with limited entry or limited quota licenses. So there's a specific number of hunters afield each year. You'll see that numbers increased until about the 70s. As far as hunter numbers, it plateaued for a while. Harvest kept increasing through that same time. But by 1991 is when you started to see things change. That is when the all-age die-off on Whiskey Mountain occurred. And you'll see that decline initiated there was the Whiskey Mountain die-off. It plateaued out for a while. We had a die-off in the southern Absarokas. That brought us down some. Then we had a die-off in the Jackson sheep herd. Another core native herd in northwest Wyoming brought us down even further. Various herds were coming back nicely. Then in 2011 through 2013, we had a die-off in the southern Absarokas again that brought us down to pretty much where we're at the current time. So if you look at those numbers, which roughly mimic population trends, we have fewer hunters afield this year than we have since 1959. And then if you look at ram harvest, last year we took fewer rams than we have since 1976. So definitely we've got population challenges and things are still occurring in Wyoming that are difficult to address. Population monitoring has an impact on this. When we have very large populations that exist in relatively remote places, they can be hard to just monitor their abundance, let alone when a disease event has happened. And I'm sure my friends and colleagues in Canada and Alaska can appreciate this as well, where you have really large intact populations. For example, just in the Absarokas, there's almost 200,000 or 2 million acres of occupied bighorn sheep habitat, over 3,000 square miles of occupied sheep habitat just in the Absarokas. For the first time ever this July, we did fly that to try and get a good abundance estimate at the same time. We've never flown all those areas at once. It took 2 helicopters, almost 90 hours of flight time and over 4,000 miles of line flown. We did classify over 3,000 sheep, but this is the kind of effort that can't be done very often. So we have challenges there just detecting what's going on with some of these populations. This is an example from the extreme large population end, but the same thing applies to small populations in remote areas where we might have less than 100 sheep. They can be equally as difficult to survey. So one of the tools that we use to detect what might be going on is pickup heads. So in Wyoming, you're statutorily allowed to pick up dead bighorn sheep and pack the skulls and horns out of the mountains. So we've done that since we've been registering sheep since 1977. And you can look at these trends in these three herds. You look at Whiskey Mountain on the upper left, the all-age die-off in 1991, a big spike in the number of pickup heads that were turned in, and then kind of a return to perhaps normal or slightly above normal. And then that's where it's kind of been since. Jackson, the all-age die-off was in 2001 and into 2002. There you saw the tremendous spike in pickup heads turned in there and kind of a return. And then the Absarokas, you see populations are increasing through the 70s and pickup heads are increasing as well. The 1995 die-off in the southern Absarokas can be seen here with the number of pickup heads turned in, then kind of a rebuilding phase, and it goes up and down and all over. And then 2011 was a significant spring storm event in March that triggered a population decline that persisted for 3 years. So over those 3 years, there were more than 250 ram heads turned in from 2011 through 2013. And this is an example of, without these pickup heads, we probably would not have even detected this occurring on the landscape. So a few things that we've been doing for the past 10 years, we've been doing a statewide disease surveillance effort. We've sampled almost 1,000 sheep and a sample of mountain goats in there as well. Just looking at pathogen presence or absence, collecting some additional information on sinus tumors, pregnancy status, micronutrients, et cetera. So that's helped us understand a statewide perspective of what's going on with our sheep herds. This is the result of those sampling efforts, and I can't get into the details here of this sampling, but one of the big take homes is, with the exception of the Targhee herd here in the Tetons, all of our big native sheep herds in Northwest Wyoming have a pretty full complement of lethal pathogens. So the mix throughout the rest of the state is kind of a mixed bag of pathogens, but at least in our big herds where 80 to 85% of our sheep exist, they have pretty much a full complement of pathogens there. We've also picked up nasal tumors in most of our sheep herds. These red hunt areas show where we have documented sinus tumors. The pink shows where we suspect that those occur just based on exchange of movement with neighboring herds. Somewhat alarming, we've sampled 65 heads so far, and almost a third of them have been positive for sinus tumors. And then we also have documented a sinus tumor in a mountain goat as well just recently. Research-wise, we've been working with Dr. Kevin Monteith and his graduate students, Brittany Wagler and Rachel Smiley, kind of trying to tie all this together as far as pathogen status with various physiological parameters, body condition, habitat conditions, et cetera, to kind of tease out what might be playing various roles in these populations, using the Absarokas, the Jackson, and the Whiskey Mountain sheep herd as test cases, because they are all responding a little differently with respect to all of those kind of attributes. So again, I don't have time to get into the outcome with that, but that is an ongoing research effort that we're actually even expanding into another component of the Whiskey Mountain herd this coming year. Speak just briefly about our Bighorn sheep, domestic sheep interaction working group. This is something that that many of you are familiar with, but this is a group that was convened in the year 2000 to address bighorn sheep, domestic sheep interaction issues. In 2015, it was codified into Wyoming state law as our management plan on how we will address issues relating to the interaction between domestic and wild sheep. Of course, we produced a final report and recommendations in 2004, which basically is the plan, although there's a lot more in there than is really the plan. The plan is mostly terms of agreement on how we address this issue. Those terms of agreement are such things as working on a voluntary basis and never under a sense of urgency or duress, trying to minimize the rhetoric and not discussing various minute details as far as the levels of risk, but recognizing that risk does exist, and not using this as an issue or a surrogate issue for addressing other issues that might exist on the landscape. But this is specifically to address bighorn sheep and domestic sheep interactions. Also, recommendations came out of this as far as protocols for how we actually do translocations, more in terms of the public and individual involvement of stakeholders in those translocations, but also up into including research recommendations that we've been chipping away at as well. So the overall goal of that group is just to maintain healthy bighorn sheep populations, but also having a viable domestic sheep industry in Wyoming as well. Kind of the crux of it is our prioritization of sheep herds. And we recognize fully that we were relatively fortunate in Wyoming, that the hand we were dealt had most of our bighorn sheep, like I said earlier, 85% of the sheep in Northwest Wyoming existed in mostly national forest and BLM lands, tremendous backcountry wilderness areas. Those herds had never been extirpated. Those are what we termed our core native herds and put our highest priority on. Those are areas where, as per the Wyoming plan, we'll make all efforts to prevent contact between bighorn and domestic sheep. But again, as agreed to by that Wyoming plan. Most of the rest of the herds in the state that are all translocated herds are what we call cooperative review herds. And they're areas where any change in domestic sheep use or bighorn sheep management will be cooperatively evaluated. One of the continuing challenges here is it's not really specified what cooperatively evaluated means. So these are some of the challenges that we're currently addressing is how do we work through those issues with the cooperative review herds. Similarly, there are two non-emphasis herds in the state. Those are on the Bighorn Mountains on national forest, and then in the Wyoming and Salt Ranges in Western Wyoming. And those are areas where we won't make any effort to prioritize or emphasize bighorn sheep unless agreed to by this interaction working group. And we won't protect bighorn sheep populations at the expense of domestic sheep grazing. These areas were identified because of the number of domestic sheep allotments on those public lands and the relatively small bighorn sheep populations there. One of the challenges there is what do you do when you have a non-emphasis herd up against a core native herd, and how far do you go into a non-emphasis herd to protect a core native herd? So we still have challenges within this plan, but it has given us good guidance in the past. And it's actually brought us to a situation where the map on the left shows all of the domestic sheep allotments in the greater Yellowstone area at one time. And through the work of the land management agencies, and definitely the lead being the Wyoming chapter of the Wild Sheep Foundation and national as well, with numerous collaborators, contributors, and funding partners, we basically removed the risk of domestic sheep pathogen exposure risk to our core native herds in Northwest Wyoming. That's been done through I can't even start to name the variety of techniques, from moving allotments from one national forest to another, or moving the producer from one forest to another, to shifting allotments, to reconfiguring allotments, to straight out retirements. Working with those agencies, the individual producers, that is something that those groups have excelled in and have actually at least addressed that issue for our core native herds. We, as most agencies, have a lethal removal protocol. Our history is it's probably always occurred. Our awareness of it and awareness of it being as important an issue as it is was perhaps not recognized until the mid-2000s fully. That's when our first policy was adopted. It was revised in 2013 to recognize some changes in dealing with feral livestock, but at least recently we've been removing about 4 sheep a year under that policy of lethal removal. The image on the upper left is what that usually looks like, is an individual bighorn sheep showing up on private lands near a domestic sheep or goat operation, and that individual is lethally removed. We do try and remove those non-lethally or capture them if possible, and if there is room at our Symposium research facility, but that's not always the case. Recently, though, dealing with a group of 5 individuals that were on private land close to some farm flocks of goats and sheep, we did do a helicopter net gun operation to remove 5 individuals and take them to our Symposium research facility. When we found that when we start dealing with more and more sheep, the public is pretty well accepting of removing individuals for disease risk, but when you talk about more individuals, it gets a little more tenuous as far as public support. The individual ram on the upper right is an example of how difficult this can be. This was a collared ram from Colorado that many of you are aware of, but this was a ram that Colorado gave us a heads up that it was moving. It moved from Granby, and over the course of 3 months before our folks could dispatch it, it moved almost 400 miles. That individual, at least in Wyoming, moved through 3 different bighorn sheep herds. No telling how many domestic animals it could have been exposed to, but movements of that magnitude, although they may not occur that often, just reveal the challenges of trying to deal with disease. And removing these individuals is absolutely the right thing to do. We found in our experience, most of these rams that we've removed when we started sampling for sinus tumors, they're positive for sinus tumors. 40% approximately have leukotoxin positive Mannheimia hemolytica. 20% of them end up having Mycoplasma pneumoniae or leukotoxin positive Biebersteinia triolosi. So removing them is the correct thing to do to minimize risk. We also have a feral livestock statute in Wyoming that allows the identification of feral or stray livestock to be removed. That requires very close coordination with our state veterinarian, who has been very good to work with as far as this process goes. And we have dealt with just a few individual cases of this, but there is an avenue for dealing with feral or stray livestock that is recognized by statute. Mountain goats, this is kind of a tricky and a touchy one. I'll just take a few minutes and explain to you our mountain goat management philosophy, if you will. Our mountain goats in Wyoming came from our neighbors in Montana, Area 1 up here on the Montana state line. That population in the Beartooth Mountains came from Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. That is an area where we promote mountain goat hunting and viewing. We want to see robust and thriving mountain goat populations. Similarly, in Area 2 on the boundary of border of Wyoming with Idaho, those goats came in from a translocation that Idaho did in the late 60s, early 70s. And that's another place where our management is to promote mountain goats hunting and viewing opportunities there. The mountain goats in the Beartooth began to expand into the Absarokas in that hunt area 3. That area was designed to force hunting pressure there. We have pretty liberal seasons. We're trying to manage for very low mountain goat densities there. The concern is we have the bulk of the sheep in the absorptives winter at high elevations, and we're talking anywhere from 9 to 12,000 feet. And so they're residing there year round. Summertime is probably not a concern as far as competition or disease transmission, but on those extremely limited high elevation winter ranges where they're kind of threading the needle as far as their existence goes in the wintertime without any additional challenges. The bar for proving that there's a risk there is pretty low for us. So that is our concern, is the high elevation winter ranges of bighorn sheep in the native sheep herds of Northwest Wyoming. So we're trying to manage for lower goat densities there. And then we've also seen expansion into the Tetons, and we have another small but very important native sheep herd there that we would like to see mountain goat densities reduced, or if not eliminated there, due to the risk of competition and disease to the existing bighorn sheep there. These two hunt areas were created specifically for that purpose. Traditionally, mountain goat hunting in Wyoming has been a once-in-a-lifetime endeavor. Those two areas, 4 and 5, were exempted from that. So if you draw a license, you could hunt mountain goats every single year. They're low success, high effort endeavors, but the intent is to keep mountain goat densities very, very low. And then, of course, Grand Teton National Park has embarked on a couple different undertakings to reduce and minimize goat populations in the Tetons as well, that I probably don't have much time to speak to, but we've worked closely with them, and they just completed a skilled volunteer effort there, and have addressed some of the goals that we share with persistence of the Teton bighorn sheep herd as well. And then I'd just like to close with this for my friend Tom Stevenson in the Sierras in California, that it's a little suspicious that this might be a shadow business of his, because you'll see that this is Sierra Mountain Canine Formula of roasted lamb. And, you know, I did have to pay $6 for this can of dog food. So I just am a little worried that Tom's making a little cash on the side, and might even suggest that the council open up a formal investigation into this. So with that, probably don't have time for questions, but take them at any point. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Doug. Yeah, we're pretty much on time, but we'll maybe leave it at that. Encouraging to see the communication in Wyoming with regards to the bighorn sheep and the domestic sheep folks working together to solve problems that face each group. And Wyoming has wrestled with this for a long time, and it's good to see some success coming out of that. Helen, I would encourage you, if you could share your screen at this point.